Okay, let's jump in. We're tackling a principle today that, well, you've almost definitely heard of, maybe even used it yourself, Occam's razor.
Uh-huh. It's everywhere.
It really is. But maybe, just maybe, the way it gets tossed around misses quite a bit of the original idea. So we're going deep, using an article called Where Did Occam's Razor Come From as our guide. It really digs into the history, the philosophy behind it, and, the stuff that gets lost in translation.
Yeah, it's more than just a catchphrase.
Exactly. Our mission here is to get past that, the quick internet definition. We want to understand what Occam's razor really means, where it topped up, how it became this thinking tool, and why it's definitely not just the simplest answer wins.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Get ready, because its origins are pretty surprising. We'll see how it shapes science, but also why using it without care, well, it can actually cut you, like a real razor.
And that's a great place to start, because the phrase everyone thinks is Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is best.
Oh,
That's not really it.
okay.
The actual principle, the core idea, it's phrased differently. It's entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity.
Huh.
Entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity.
Yeah.
Okay, that lands differently. It feels less about easy answers and more about efficiency, or maybe trimming the fat.
Exactly. Lean thinking, perhaps, is about parsimony, cutting back. The article really stresses this. If you have, say, two theories, and both seem to explain what you're seeing equally well,
They both work.
they both have similar predictive power, right? The razor suggests you should lean towards the one that makes you assume fewer new things, fewer unsupported entities, fewer concepts. You just have to sort of, take on faith without direct proof.
So it's not about the explanation being easy to understand, but about it needing less baggage, fewer extra bits you can't actually point to.
Precisely. It's about minimizing those unproven assumptions, cutting away what isn't strictly necessary for the explanation to hold water. Okay, that distinction feels really important. Assumptions, not just simplicity. And this is tied to William of Ockham, right? Tell us about him. Sounds like a straightforward guy with a simple principle.
Well, that's the interesting part. The article paints quite a picture. Born in Occam, Surrey, hence the name, around 1258. He was a Franciscan friar, educated at Oxford, clearly a sharp mind, lectured on major theological works.
Okay, standard academic path for the time.
To a point. But his life got complicated. He got tangled up in some pretty fierce debates, especially with the Dominican order. A big one was about church wealth.
Money. Always complicated.
Right. The Franciscans following St. Francis were big on absolute poverty. Occam was right there with them, and this put him directly against the Pope and the established church hierarchy, who weren't exactly living aesthetically.
So he picked a fight with the Pope over wealth? That sounds risky.
It's extremely. It escalated to the point where Occam basically called the Pope a heretic. He had to flee, ended up under protection in Munich, and died there around 1347. So the irony is the guy associated with this principle of simplifying things had an incredibly complex, politically charged life.
Wow. Okay, so a life full of conflict gives birth to a principle about paring things down. Where did he apply this razor most sharply in his own work?
Primarily in the big philosophical clash of his day, nominalism versus realism. The article flags this as the razor's original battleground.
Nominalism and realism. Okay, break those down for us.
Sure. Occam was a champion of nominalism. As the article lays it out, nominalism basically says that those abstract categories we use, like blueness or dogness, the general quality shared by all blue things or all dogs, they don't exist as real things out there in the world, separate from our minds.
So they're just labels, concepts in our heads.
Exactly. Names, mental concepts. That's it. This was a huge challenge to the dominant view, Aristotelian realism, which argued that these universals did have some kind of real, independent metaphysical existence.
Like a perfect balloonness floating around somewhere.
Sort of, yeah. A metaphysical reality. And this is where Occam brought out the razor. He argued, essentially, why do we need to assume these invisible, abstract entities exist? We can explain how we categorize the world just fine by saying these are concepts in our minds.
So he was using the razor to shave off those extra metaphysical assumptions.
Precisely. He was cutting away what he saw as unnecessary clutter in the realist worldview. Why multiply these abstract entities if you don't absolutely need them to explain how we think and talk about the world?
It's like philosophical decluttering. Don't keep metaphysical furniture you don't need.
You got it. And the article points out, this was a really big deal. By shifting focus away from assumed abstract realities and towards what's needed to explain our experience, it helped lay some serious groundwork for empiricism. The idea that knowledge comes from observation and experience.
Right, focusing on what you can actually see or test, not just assume. That makes perfect sense. And this idea of preferring simpler explanations. It wasn't totally new with Occam, was it? The article mentions it goes way back.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
The basic impulse don't make things more complicated than they need to be. You can find hints of it much earlier. Aristotle, various thinkers in Muslim, Jewish, Christian traditions, they all touched on similar ideas. Occam just really sharpened it and used it as a key tool in those specific debates.
He weaponized it almost.
In a philosophical sense, yes.
Oh.
And interestingly, the actual name Occam's razor didn't even appear until centuries later. Yeah, the article credits a logician named Libertus in 1649. He was the one who coined the term, specifically talking about how Occam and the nominalists shaved off those extra metaphysical bits. So the name explicitly links back to that philosophical purpose.
Wow. So, ancient idea, Occam gives it teeth, the catchy name comes way later. Okay, let's move this into science. How did this philosophical tool start shaping how we investigate the physical universe?
Well, the classic example, the one everyone points to, is that big shift from the Earth-centered to the Sun-centered model of the solar system.
Geocentric versus heliocentric.
Right, so Ptolemy's old model, with Earth sitting still in the middle, it worked, sort of. But to make the planets move the way we see them move, especially that weird backward or retrograde motion.
Yeah, but it had complications.
Oh, yeah. They added these incredibly complex epicycles, basically. Planets moving in little circles while orbiting in bigger circles. It got very Rube Goldberg-esque.
Just to make the math fit the picture of Earth at the center.
Exactly. And along come Copernicus and later Galileo saying, hang on, what if the sun is in the center? Suddenly that retrograde motion isn't some bizarre planetary dance. It's just, an optical effect. It's Earth lapping the slower outer planets.
Much simpler.
Way simpler. It explained the observations just as well, arguably better, with far fewer weird assumptions about how planets must move. Fewer epicycles, less metaphysical baggage. A classic razor application.
Okay, that's a clear win for fewer assumptions explaining the same thing. But the razor isn't always just about picking the explanation that looks simplest on paper, right? The article uses gravity as a counterpoint, which is fascinating.
It is, and this is super important for understanding the limits. Think about gravity. Aristotle had a pretty simple idea. Objects naturally move towards the center of the universe. Feels straightforward.
Okay, simple concept.
Then Newton comes along, his theory. Universal gravitation, an attractive force between any two objects with mass, acting instantly across space. Now, that's arguably more complex conceptually, right? It's this invisible force reaching everywhere.
Yeah, definitely more moving parts than just things fall down.
And then Einstein.
Yeah.
General relativity. Gravity isn't even a force. It's the curvature of space-time itself caused by mass and energy. That's a lot more complex than Newton's idea.
Way more complex, mind-bendingly so. So if the razor favors simplicity, why did science go for Newton over Aristotle and Einstein over Newton?
Because, and this is the crucial point the article makes, the more complex theories were better. They made more accurate predictions. Newton's gravity explained planetary orbits far better than Aristotle's idea.
Right.
And Einstein's theory, while much more complex, explained things Newton's couldn't, like tiny wobbles in Mercury's orbit or how gravity bends light, something famously confirmed during that 1919 solar eclipse.
Ah, so the complexity was necessary for accuracy.
Exactly. Occam's razor doesn't say pick the dumbed-down version. It says, if two theories explain things equally well, prefer the one with fewer unnecessary assumptions. If adding complexity is required to actually match reality better or make more precise predictions, then that complexity is justified. It's essential, not superfluous.
Got it. It's about justification, not just simplicity itself. And this idea of needing to match reality, needing to be tested. The article links the razor to another really key idea in science, falsifiability.
It does. It's a natural extension. A good scientific theory shouldn't just be elegantly simple. It has to be vulnerable. You need to be able, in principle at least, to design an experiment that could prove it wrong.
If it can explain absolutely anything that happens, it's not really explaining anything specific.
Precisely. The article uses the contrast between, say, Freud's psychoanalytic theories and Einstein's relativity to make this point.
How do they differ in that respect?
Well, many of Freud's ideas, the unconscious, repression, defense mechanisms, they could be very powerful for storytelling, for making sense of behavior after the fact. But they were often slippery, hard to pin down experimentally.
Meaning?
If a patient's behavior seemed to contradict a Freudian idea, well, the theory often had a way to explain that away too. Maybe another defense mechanism kicked in, or it was resistance. It made it really hard to devise a clear test that could definitively say, nope, this part of the theory is wrong.
Okay. It could morph to fit the data.
Right. Einstein's theory, on the other hand, even being complex, made very specific, testable predictions. Like the exact amount light should bend during an eclipse. If those astronomers in 1919 hadn't seen the stars shift exactly as predicted,
That theory would have been in big trouble.
big trouble. It stuck its neck out. And this idea that a theory has to be potentially provable false to be truly scientific, that's Karl Popper's famous principle of falsifiability. The article frames it as a sort of logical evolution from Occam's initial paring down of assumptions.
From shaving off unnecessary entities to demanding that the remaining entities make testable claims. That's a really clear progression.
Okay, the article then brings up this interesting sort of contemporary side note about suppressed memories. How does that fit in?
Yeah, it's presented as a kind of modern case study where different ways of thinking clash. It looked at the debate within psychology about whether suppressed or repressed memories, traumatic events supposedly pushed entirely out of conscious recall, are a real phenomenon.
And there's disagreement on this.
Oh, definitely. The article cites a 2013 study suggesting a big split. On one side, you have many practicing clinicians, therapists working day-to-day with patients. A high percentage, maybe 60 to 90% in that study, tend to believe these memories exist and can be recovered.
Based on what they hear in therapy sessions, presumably?
Right, based on clinical experience, patient reports. But then you have the research psychologists, the ones doing controlled experiments on memory in labs. And in that same study, a majority of them, maybe around 70%, were skeptical or didn't believe repressed memories operate in that way. Wow, that's a significant divide.
It is. And the article uses it to illustrate this tension between conclusions drawn from, say, clinical experience versus those drawn from experimental data. It highlights how different kinds of evidence, perhaps relying on different underlying assumptions about how memory works, can lead to very different pictures of reality. It's a modern example of a field grappling with complex explanations and differing evidence bases.
That's fascinating. Different evidence, different assumptions, different conclusions. So Occam's razor is this tool for cutting back, for simplifying where possible. Are there any counterprinciples? Anything that says, whoa, hold on, don't simplify too much?
Yes, absolutely. The article points out that even back in Occam's time, there were thinkers pushing back against potential oversimplification. Walter Chatton, a contemporary of Occam, had what's sometimes called an anti-razor.
An anti-razor, what is it?
Yeah. The gist was basically, don't get rid of complexity if it's actually needed. If the evidence points to something being complex, or if you need a distinction to accurately describe what's going on, you shouldn't ignore it just to make things look simpler.
Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Kind of, yeah. And later philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, also warned against being too quick to reduce the number of explanatory principles. He cautioned against rashly diminishing complexity.
So are these fighting against Occam's razor?
Not necessarily fighting against it. The article frames them more as essential checks and balances. They're reminders that the goal isn't just simplicity for simplicity's sake. It's finding the explanation that is sufficiently complex to account for reality, but no more complex than necessary. They stop you from cutting away something vital in your quest for tidiness.
Okay, that makes sense. A balance. Don't add unnecessary stuff, but also don't remove necessary stuff.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, we've really covered some ground here. We went from that, that simple phrase you hear everywhere all the way back to a feisty medieval philosopher.
Whose life was anything but simple.
Right. We saw how his razor wasn't just about simplicity, but about necessary assumptions, how it helped shape scientific thinking through things like the heliocentric model, but also how it hits limits when complexity is needed, like with Einstein's gravity, and the crucial link to making sure ideas are testable, falsifiable.
And even seeing how these debates play out today, like with the memory research.
Yeah. So the big takeaway seems to be, Occam's razor is a powerful heuristic, a guide. When explanations have equal power, trust the one that makes fewer unsupported leaps. Shave away the unnecessary entities.
Right. And that final metaphor from the article really nails it. The razor is a tool. You can get a nice close shave. Just be careful not to cut too close.
Perfect.
Because as we saw with gravity, sometimes you need that added complexity for a better fit with reality. Or as with the memory debate, different kinds of evidence might lead to different conclusions, maybe involving different necessary assumptions. Parsimony is a great starting point, a great tiebreaker, but it's not the only game in town. Accuracy and testability matter hugely.
It really makes you think. that metaphor, don't cut too close. Where, in your own thinking, or maybe in the news you read or the arguments you hear, where might you be tempted to simplify too much? Where might you be shaving away complexity that's actually needed or overlooking assumptions that really underpin an argument? Definitely something to chew on until our next deep dive.